From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis, joining you for yet another week. Yes, I know you are a little bleary-eyed as you're watching the show today because you spent all that time climbing fences in Wrigleyville trying to look through people's windows to see what was going on because you couldn't actually participate by being in the ballpark. But today, reality sets in that, yes, we do have a world champion baseball team in the city of Chicago, a couple of them now, and but we still have all these other things we have to talk about. So it's my job to be kind of like the librarian here and say, all right, enough of this celebrating. Let's talk about budgets. Let's talk about the school system. Let's talk about the Illinois legislature. Okay, are you ready? Are you ready to take this trip with us? Well, here to help us with that is Bobby Otter. First time on the show. I'm glad to have you here, Bobby. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thank
Bobby
you
Otter is with the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, and they do a lot of really important analysis of really important things. And back when we scheduled you, we had no idea that we would be sitting here in the morning after. But
no, we did not.
There you are. Buried in the news, because the newspapers seem to be, there's only one story in the papers this morning, is this one. This is an interesting little story that sometimes managed to put on page 15 today. There is a contract, as we know, between CPS and CTU, and that is just unbridled good news as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it was done without a strike. It was done with relatively little strife. It was done with some respectful statements on both sides. It lasts for 4 years. It takes a lot of anxiety off the table, and I think it's probably an all-around piece of very good news.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that we avoided a strike is huge. And that, kids are in school, teachers are teaching, parents don't have to worry about any labor issues, hopefully, for the next 3 years, because as you said, it is a 4-year deal, though the first year of the deal
is over
already happened. Right. And so we're looking now at a 3-year deal through 2019. But yeah, I mean, I think it's great news all around that they were able to avoid a strike, because the last 4 years ago when we had one, nobody really benefited from that.
Right. Now, your job, of course, is to look at numbers and to help us walk through this swamp, this thicket of competing, arguing about numbers. But the first question that I think is not answerable, but I'll ask it anyway, is what did this cost? What did this settlement cost?
Yeah, it's hard to know because we don't. It really depends on your jumping off point here. You're hearing the district say that they're saving a lot of money compared to the last contract. Well, the last contract really wasn't on the table. Didn't seem like that was ever really a possibility. The union is saying that they're going to put more money into the classroom, and that definitely looks to be the case. Though how much is probably up for debate, and depending again on where you're using the jumping off point. I'm not sure where the union is using, but it seems like probably that November tentative deal, last January when they have a tentative deal.
That the union rejected.
Yeah, overall it looks pretty cost neutral at the end of the day when you kind of add the numbers up. There's probably some more cost than the district expected or was budgeting for FY17. That looks to be the case, and the Sun-Times story is kind of confirming that. Though it's not like a ton of more money. It's not like the last contract ended up costing the district about $175 to $100 million in that first year, more than they budgeted. This looks like about $50 million as the Sun-Times is reporting. A lot of the savings actually probably took place last year because there was no COLAs, cost of living adjustments made last year. There were no step-in lanes for teachers last year. So a lot of the savings probably already happened for the district, and I think from my perspective, the concern there is the district still had to borrow $500 million, about $500 million to get through the last fiscal year.
Even with those savings.
Even with those savings.
Right.
Now, it looks like for the most part, they'll be able to budget without probably having to borrow more money. For this year, with this contract, it looks like they're just going to use the additional TIF money to get to pay for this. But in FY18, FY19, we're still looking at, again, roughly a $500 million deficit for the district. And again, I mean, to go back to FY17, I mean, the budget is contingent on the state coming to some sort of pension reform agreement.
Right. Okay, well, let's see if we can sort of pick off each of these things. To me, one of the biggest unanswered questions, and we've been hammering on this around here, is this thing about the deal that was struck in Springfield that got the funding for CPS was contingent on it's like about $215 million that CPS will get when there is pension reform.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
What does
At the
that
state level,
mean?
too.
Absolutely nobody can explain what that means.
Well, yeah, I mean, the specifics of what sort of pension reform is up for debate. I mean, could they just pass, for instance, SB 1, which they passed under Governor Quinn and has since been found unconstitutional? I mean, would that qualify? Would that release the $215 million? I think it would, but who knows? Mm-hmm. But I mean, yes, they could pass another unconstitutional pension reform bill, they can pass another pension reform bill that may be found unconstitutional, or most likely would be found unconstitutional. And I guess supposedly that would free up the money for CPS.
So they would just play, you're thinking that they might just play a little shell game then and just say,
I don't know if it's a shell game, but
here's pension reform. Of course, we've tried it before and it doesn't work, but just to trigger this funding, we'll pass this.
It's unclear. It's unclear totally what pension reform means.
I mean, when I think of the governor saying, I won't give you this money until you give me pension reform, I would think that he wouldn't consider anything to be pension reform unless it somehow or other clipped the wings of the CTU. And this contract didn't clip anybody's wings, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I don't want to speculate on what the governor's thinking or what his modes are here, but I think the deal with the CTU is kind of separate from whatever pension reform means. It looks like pension reform is actually a state level agreement to free up that $215 million for the for CPS to receive that $215.
Is there more money than the $215 that would go to other entities? Is CPS?
It would just be for CPS.
I thought that. Yeah, it is just strictly for CPS.
Yeah, there were a bunch of other bills that were passed back in June, or July, sorry. No, it was June, sorry. Back in June that did provide more money to districts across the state, including CPS. They received about $100 million. And they're receiving that money, and other districts receive money too. Right. And then, of course, they also allowed the district to increase the property tax levy or create a property tax levy for the pensions, for the CTU pensions. But this is the only monies that right now CPS doesn't have in the bank. They've budgeted to receive it, but they don't actually have it right now.
So it's a kind of a weird situation then. I mean, 200. What is that? How does that express itself as a part of how much money CPS will spend this year? It's, I mean, what is their actual budget?
Yeah, their actual budget's under $6 billion.
$6 billion,
about around $5.5 billion.
So $200 million is a relatively small piece of the budget.
Total budget. Yes, but
but it's
the
enough.
district doesn't have any reserves right now.
Right.
They've drawn down reserves countless number of times. So, if they don't receive the money, the big question is, how are they going to pay for that? Where are they going to find the $250 million? Because it's not in reserves. Yeah. It's not coming from the teacher contract now. We know that, and there won't be $200 million in savings from the teacher contract.
Right.
So, this district could be looking at a situation where they need to find $200 million in May or June, either to meet payroll or make their pension payment.
So it's just another.
It's unclear. I mean,
It's another one of these high wire acts where it's just like you just assume the money's going to come and you just got to plow on.
Yeah.
Wow. So I think another issue that I know WBEZ has worked on, and you, I think, helped them with that, is if you look at an analysis of CPS budget, not only over this year, but over like a longer period of time, maybe the 4 years of the contract, there are a couple of things that unhappily, I guess, work in CPS's favor. And some of them are just demographic, that we're just losing population, or not even losing population, but there are fewer children, so there are fewer children attending the schools, right?
Yeah, this I think has kind of gone, BEZ's done a decent job, but I think a lot of people probably aren't totally aware of, this is a really big issue because it affects funding, especially from the state. The district has been losing students every year at about 1% clip, but this year we saw a pretty substantial loss of students of roughly 12,000 from last year. That's going to impact the bottom line of the district, maybe not this year, but in years to come, because of the way the state formula works, it depends on how many students you're educating, and if the number of students go down, then they're going to receive less money from the state. That's problematic because so much, I shouldn't say so much, but a lot of CPS's costs right now won't also decline with the decline in enrollment. Now, if you have fewer students, you need less teachers, and so you've seen fewer teachers in the district over time. That makes sense. But the district's pension costs right now, and unfunded liability on those pensions, that's one of the main drivers for CPS right now is the cost of the pensions. And if enrollment goes down, that means revenue goes down, even though the pension cost, this unfunded liability and whatnot, is going to continue, at least isn't going away. And so they need the money to continue to pay that. So they're seeing declining revenue, but expenditures are either going to stay flat or most likely increase with the pension.
But there's so many moving parts to this machine, because if the enrollment goes down, CPS can lay off teachers. The contract allows them to lay off teachers for declining enrollment, right? Correct. So over the next few years, they could lose a lot of teachers, which would save them. And we've already seen that. Which would save them money.
I mean, it doesn't, it's more cost neutral because they're not receiving the same money that they normally would for those students from the state.
Point well taken, right.
It's not, I wouldn't say CPS is saving money, it's just that, there's declining enrollment, that means less revenue from the state.
That everything
and
is just declining.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the other issue here is that CPS's revenues are, there's a pressure, they're not raising enough revenue, and this isn't necessarily their fault. The property tax and local taxes are what they are. It's the state that's not meeting its obligation to properly fund CPS, and frankly, the state doesn't properly fund any district in the state of Illinois. We're 50th when it comes to state funding of education. We're dead last in the nation there,
I interrupted you while you were saying that. Let's focus on that. What number did you say we are?
We are 50th, dead last in the nation.
There's 50 states, if I remember correctly,
you are correct.
Right? Yeah,
we are last when it comes to the share of education funding that comes from the state. The state it doesn't properly fund education or K through 12 and higher ed now, considering the cuts there, does not appropriately fund education at the level that is needed, and especially districts that are at risk with a lot of at-risk students or high poverty students. They're not receiving the money that they need to properly educate their students, and CPS with 80, 85, depending on what year you're looking at, but 80 to 85% low income, that's a lot of students that aren't receiving the necessary revenue from the state to educate them. And so, yeah, CPS has this pension problem, which was self-inflicted, but the revenue problem really wasn't self-inflicted. That is a state issue. And but as I said, every district in the state, unfortunately, has the same issue.
And of course, I can't help but read almost everywhere. Every time I pick up an opinion piece about something, I hear about how we are the most heavily taxed state in the union, that thousands of people every year race across the border to escape to Indiana or Wisconsin to escape our horrible
that's
taxes.
very misleading. We are actually in the lower third when it comes to our tax burden in the state of Illinois. We have a very narrow sales tax base, for starters. So we only tax goods. Most services aren't taxed in the state of Illinois on sales taxes. So when we're talking about something like that, okay, it looks high, especially with the taxes that the county and the city and whatnot throw on top of what the state level is. But really, it's such a narrow tax base that we're not being taxed on a lot of things that other states tax people on it when it comes to consumption. And then you look at our income tax rate at 3.75, flat personal income tax rate, flat, and a flat tax, so everyone's paying that no matter how much money they make. That's one of the lower tax rates, especially when you start comparing it to most states who have graduated rates. 3.75 being the highest rate that anybody in the state can pay on income taxes. That puts us, I forget exactly, but around, I think 42 states have an income tax. That would put us, in terms of the highest rate, puts us near 40th for that when we're looking at that. So the tax burden for most residents in the state of Illinois actually ends up being your property taxes. Because how are you going to fund education now? Well, if the state's not going to chip in because it's not raising enough money, well, then that's going to come down to property taxes. And so when it comes to property taxes, we do tend to have higher property tax rates than most other states in the nation. But you're saving when it comes to sales taxes and income taxes. You're not paying what people up in Wisconsin or over in Iowa or even over in Indiana. They have a higher income tax rate than we do. So,
but of
or
course,
maybe not higher anymore, but roughly the same as we do. So at the end of the day, our total tax burden in the state of Illinois actually puts us probably around 35th in the nation.
35th, and we do hear all the time about the issue of specifically Chicago over the years refusing to continue to raise its property tax and literally, I guess you'd say, falling behind in that, and that a lot of the problems, a lot of the systemic problems we feel in Chicago have kind of arisen from that. I mean, it's hard. It's a hard thing for people to hear, but when
I think for city residents, for the most part, CPS. There's, you have your property tax bill. I think half of that money goes towards education. In Chicago, it goes towards education, goes towards CPS. CPS has been raising property taxes pretty much every year to the cap. There's been a couple years where they haven't, and suburban districts love to point that out to CPS. But for the most part, they've been raising property taxes for education, for CPS. For the city, they haven't been, as you pointed out. For the most part, they haven't until recently, frankly. And so revenue was relatively flat over those years. And what the city was doing to continue being able to pay for services that residents want was to borrow from the pension fund. So they weren't making the necessary pension payments to police, fire, labor, and municipal pension funds. And therefore, those pension funds are kind of a mess, are way underfunded at a level way below even the state or CTPF, the teachers' pension fund here in Chicago rate. And so what that's done is now that bill has come due for those pension payments, and now that's why they passed that the property tax increase last year, the mayor and the aldermen, because they need the revenue to start making those payments to get those, at least police and fire.
And the mayor's been put in the position where he really has very few alternatives other than to start really jacking up things like creating a garbage collection fee and jacking up the water rates and all these other rates are going up like crazy. Is that sustainable? Does that make sense?
The city needs revenue. Frankly, almost every government entity in the state needs money because we haven't been funding our pensions well. And so instead of having a pension problem, I like to say we have a debt problem. We've incurred a huge amount of debt and liability on our pension funds. We were borrowing against those pension funds for decades, in this case of the state, a century, and those bills are coming due because those pension funds are just not properly funded anymore. And so when you have a pension fund, in the case of police and fire, that's funded at roughly 20%, or 25%, I should say, the liability, the debt on that pension payment is just huge. And that's what we are now paying. We're paying our debt bill on those pensions.
But at the same time, Budget Director Alex Holt and the mayor are saying that they've made substantial progress in their 5 or 6 years that they've been at this, that the structural deficit is considerably lower than it was, and that they're trying to get a handle on this really expensive borrowing and that kind of thing.
I think especially in the last year, since the re-election of the mayor, they've made they've taken a number of steps to increase revenue. As you said, the garbage tax fee or the garbage fee, increasing water rates again, increasing the property tax. These are all steps that the city had to make. I think the question is waiting 4 years in the case of this mayor, or if we go back to the previous mayor even longer, waiting has a cost. It's increased the debt on, the debt on these pensions, the unfunded liability only increased. So by waiting those couple years, it's increased the debt, increased that unfunded liability, and we have to pay that back. So we needed more revenue to pay for this at the city especially, and the city used its couple tools that it has in its toolbox to increase revenue. But it looks like more is going to be needed down the line because we still haven't figured out the municipal pension issue. And that fund is in a lot of trouble, and something's going to be needed to be done there, and that's going to cost money to solve.
Yeah. Now, when they were stitching together the CPS budget, the city kicked in whatever it was, 175 million, I think it was, of so-called TIF reserves, which, however you want to describe that money. Now, of course, we all know how complicated it gets because they don't get the 175, they get their portion of it, which is, I don't know what it is, half about. So anyway, they did this. But that's a lot of money to be taking out of the TIF reserves, 175 million. I mean, I know we see some stories that there might be $1 billion sloshing around in there, but I've never believed that. But nevertheless, then the question comes up of like, okay, well, they were able to do that this year. They kind of saved their hides a little bit by doing that, but there isn't going to be another 175 million in there again next year. I mean, it replenishes, but not at that rate.
Well, you hear a lot of people say, well, let's go after the TIF funds, let's release the TIF funds. And if they were to go and release all the TIF funds, then you're right, that money wouldn't be available for next year. Releasing it at the rate that they have it now, they'll probably build that. I haven't done a thorough analysis, but it seems like they build that up. They'll build that back up, so that type of money. But if they were to declare, you hear people throwing around a $600 million, I lost my train of thought here, but that $600 million, declare that TIF funds, then yes, that wouldn't be around for next year. It's a one-time revenue generator.
This is not something that you can just plan on for the for the 4 years of the contract.
And frankly, I mean, CPS might need that money next year. So next year they might release the TIF, all that TIF funds to be able to pay all the bills in FY18. They could have to declare to if they don't get that money from the state, that $250 million from the state. That TIF money might be one answer to solve at least the FY17 problems, but it's not a long-term solution. It's not a long-term revenue, year-to-year revenue solution.
It is really remarkable every time we get into this conversation, and you think about the incredible short-sightedness of all of our political leaders in the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago over the last 20 years, 30 years, whatever it's been. Where it comes to seeing that pension money as like this piggy bank that we can either borrow against or raid because somebody else is going to have to pay for it later. And of course, when you have to pay for it, then the 20 years later, it is so much bigger than what you took out. And it just seems so easy to understand today, but not back then when they were doing it, I guess. And I've often asked the question, where was everybody? Where were all the people who should have been yelling and screaming and trying to stop this 30 years ago when, but it's just human nature, I guess. I can't explain it any other way.
I can't speak for 30 years ago.
No, I know, no one can, but it's just crazy. I want to talk a little bit about we're rapidly running out of time here, but just very briefly, if we could talk a little bit about this Lockbox amendment. If you haven't voted yet, you will be, you may already have voted on this if you have, but if you haven't voted yet, there's going to be this item on the ballot asking, in essence, should all the money that is raised for roads and bridges be spent on roads and bridges? And of course, the obvious answer is, well, yes, of course. But you guys have...
Yeah, so I mean, I think the issue with the Lockbox Amendment is not necessarily what it's trying to accomplish, but it's how they're accomplishing it. So they want to put in a constitutional amendment that says any revenue generated through transportation issues, be it the gas tax, that's probably the biggest one, that has to go towards projects, infrastructure projects for roads and transportation and whatnot. Sounds great. Using the Constitution to do that, though, greatly limits the wiggle room and the flexibility that governments have, especially local governments. Now, all of a sudden, for example, the city of Chicago, any money the city receives from the way I think a lot of people and ourselves interpret the amendment, any money that is raised through the gas tax for the city of Chicago towards their budget, they can no longer put that towards anything other than infrastructure or streets and sands. Like that's where it's going. And the city has not used that only for roads. They've used that money for other things to help them, pay for services and whatnot. So it really is going to limit the flexibility that governments, local governments especially. It's a fairly poorly written amendment, and it's not good policy. You want to give flexibility. It sounds great, and overall we agree infrastructure investment is needed at the state and city level. But there's better ways to do it. Constitutional amendment is definitely not the best way to do it. It's probably better to do it through statutes or other things to give the flexibility, because once you're locked in a constitutional amendment, you're locked in. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. You can't change it, at least for 2 years at the earliest, and possibly longer.
So you guys recommend a no vote?
A no vote just because it's not good policy.
And lots of
there's
other...
better ways to do this. It's a noble goal, but there's better ways to do it.
Yeah, and lots of other people have done the same thing. And of course, one of the criticisms has been, isn't it wonderful to have a lockbox, for roads or whatever it is? But if we were going to build our Constitution based on lockboxes, I think I would make the argument that the biggest lockbox ought to be that education thing we've been talking about already, right?
Yeah, a lot of people have made that point.
Yeah, why shouldn't we have a lockbox that says you can't raid the pension fund to pay for everything else? Or a lockbox that says you're going to fund it at least 25th or 28th or 30th in the country rather than 50th. I mean, it seems like a really kind of a piecemeal way to govern a state.
Yeah, and I think that's another fear, is that all of a sudden we just start putting constitutional amendments on how much money should go towards each, core service. Worthy cause, and then the state wouldn't be able to respond to changes either in policy, changes in ideas, changes in how to fund things. What if all of a sudden a bunch of money needs to go towards public safety for whatever reason? Well, now the state wouldn't be able to do that because they'd be locked in. That's all hypothetical, of course. But going back to the lockbox, it just takes away a lot of the flexibility that I think governments need when it comes to issues like this, because things come up.
I find myself really kind of being a bit of a hypocrite here. I'm on kind of both sides of this issue, because we've had a similar conversation about mandatory sentences for judges, and yes, I can see the reason why you might want to do that. But on the other hand, as I've argued on this program before, then why have judges? I mean, isn't the whole idea of a judge that this is someone who is going to listen to the evidence and come up with some kind of conclusion? If not, then we can replace the court system with like an ATM or something. You just stick your charge in and it spits out your jail term, and then that's it. It's as simple as that. And yes, we have a lot of contempt for our legislature and for our executive branch in this state, but nevertheless, it's what their job is.
Yeah, we elect them for a reason.
Right.
And if we're going to take away. Some of those responsibilities that they have in their job, and if we just kind of make it automated, it kind of raises bigger, probably intellectual questions to kind of consider
There's just something
about government
kind of
in general.
democratic about it in some weird way, but I don't know.
Again, I think that the goal is noble, but there's better ways to do it than put in a constitutional amendment like that.
Before you go, I want to talk to you a little bit about this report that you did on state. We were talking about state financing, but you did a fascinating report that basically shows us that we're doing our budgeting, as I think we've suspected, we're doing our budgeting basically by court order these days, and that we've just presided over the most amazing reduction in payments to vital state services, and oh, look, Cubs win. Anyway, so yes, we've done that, and it doesn't seem to be helping us in any way. I mean, I just don't get it. Can you explain what you've discovered, please?
Okay, so FY15, we're going back 2 fiscal years now. FY15 is the last year the state, the General Assembly, and the governor pass a budget. The General Assembly passed it, the governor signed it into law, everybody agreed upon it. It had roughly $25 billion in spending on general services, or general funds, as we like to say, 24.5 actually. If people remember, there was a budget impasse pretty much for all of FY16, which runs from July 1st to June 30th. So we had an actual budget for FY16 for, I forget, but it was roughly 12 hours. It wasn't long. We went 365, because it was a leap year. We went 365 days and a half without a budget for the most part. However, spending continued to take place even though we didn't have a budget last year. I mean, schools are open, hospitals receiving patients, jails continued to,
I'd say for most of us, our lives weren't really affected one way or another.
Yes. What happened was that a bunch of court orders and consent decrees were handed down by the courts, saying you have to continue spending money on healthcare, so like Medicaid, for example, so hospitals can continue to get paid for seeing patients. A lot of human services also fell into this category, and some public safety fell into this category. They did pass a budget for K through 12 education, so the schools got their money last year, and they didn't pass anything, and the courts really didn't say anything on higher education. So higher ed actually went most of the year without money. Now they did a couple things throughout the course of the year, and roughly about $700 million got to higher ed, which is still a huge cut from the previous year. In FY15, we spent $1.9 billion on higher education. In FY16, we spent $622 million on higher education.
Wow.
So a $1.3 billion cut in higher education. That was voted on. The General Assembly and the governor, everybody voted on that, signed it into law. So on the education side, everybody agreed upon this. But that only consisted of about $7 billion of spending at the state level. We still spent another roughly $21 billion. So only a third of what was spent was actually approved by the General Assembly and the governor. That's their job, right, to pass the budget. They only passed a third of the budget. The other 2/3 was in the form of consent decrees and court orders and continuing appropriations. So things continue to happen. Then when you kind of drill down even more and look at what they actually spent, so they got the authority to spend $21.5 billion, but they only actually spent $20 billion. So there's about $1.5 billion that the state was authorized to spend, again, through court orders, consent decrees and whatnot, but they didn't spend that, and that's the gray area. Why didn't they spend that? Who made that decision? What programs weren't properly funded? That's kind of up for debate right now, and that's kind of what our report looked at, is kind of drilling down through 15, using 15 as a starting point, through 16 and looking at, okay, what was approved? And again, 2/3 of that was from consent decree and
Right,
court
right,
orders, not the elected officials, which is how it normally should work. And therefore, there was a lot of non-transparency. So we didn't see, especially once we start digging into this $1.5 billion of spending that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Why didn't it happen? And we don't know because
There was no
again,
public
there was
deliberation
no
on
public,
it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, as you say, fully 2/3 of the 16 general fund spending on current services was neither transparent to the public nor made in a manner that permits the public to hold state elected officials accountable. So this is a very screwed up government. I mean, it just really is. So 467 million, which is more than a quarter of the year of public safety, was cut.
Exactly.
And 508 million, or about 10% of the year-to-year budgeting for human services, was cut.
Correct.
But as you say, that was not a legislative initiative. There was not
No,
a
there
bill
was
on the
no-
floor saying we're going to cut human services
Nobody
by
took
10%.
that vote.
They just
the
did
governor
it.
never signed it into law. It's just money that wasn't spent.
And where is that money? It's in a lockbox.
Well, the state actually, that's the other issue. The state's revenues do not meet their expenditures.
So they didn't have the money.
So they didn't have the money. Now, we've been running the state on a deficit for decades at this point. So the state has, continued operating with this deficit, but this increased the deficit. Now, because they didn't spend the money, they didn't increase the deficit as much as they ended up increasing it. But yes, I mean, the state never really had the money, and then they didn't spend the money, and it's unclear who made this decision or why they didn't spend it, what programs didn't get funded. It leaves more questions than answers at the end of the day.
Yeah, I would say so. So, I mean, somebody said, wow, we just don't have the money. Let's cut public safety spending in Illinois by more than a quarter. And that was just done in some room somewhere. And it wasn't actually a policy decision. It just kind of happened. And you can't tell me what committee voted on that, because none did. You can't tell me who did it and why.
Exactly.
And I, as a citizen, didn't have any part in it because I voted for representatives and senators, and they may or may not have even been a part of this decision.
Correct.
It's pretty amazing.
It is.
It is pretty amazing.
It's pretty amazing, yes.
All right. Well, thanks for...
On that uplifting note.
Really. Our job is to take this inflated euphoria over the Cubs and bring it back down to a level of understanding that we're just pretty screwed up. All right? And he's a Sox fan anyway, so what difference does it make?
Yeah. Maybe I brought the Cubs fans down to my level today after this discussion.
All right, well, Bobby, thank you. Thanks very much.
No problem.
Bobby Otter is with the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, and they have been very good to us here by coming to the program and talking to us about all the studies that they do and all the things that they understand that we don't, and trying to put it into English so that we can begin to understand them. Next week on the show, we're going to talk about... Next week will be the 10th of November, which is going to be 2 days after the 8th of November. And we will be here to try to explain to you how Donald Trump won the presidency and what happened in the last 24 hours that it all collapsed. We'll explain it next week on the show. We got a panel of good, high-powered people, and we're going to blow it out for an hour and have a good time. Or I think we will anyway. Hope you'll watch it there, and thank you very much for watching. Remember, you can watch any Chicago Newsroom by going to this address right here. Chicago Newsroom is a production of CAN TV, and we're very proud of that. And thank you very much for watching. See you next week. Bye.